There is a feeling you've probably never been able to explain. Not because you didn't try, but because every time you searched for the right words, they somehow slipped away. It's quieter than sadness, deeper than loneliness. It's an ache that doesn't seem to belong to this lifetime. Maybe you've felt it while standing outside late at night. The world has finally gone silent. The noise of the day has disappeared. You look up at the stars, and for just a moment, something inside you breaks open, not with fear, not with excitement, with longing, a homesickness so deep that it almost catches you off guard. And the strangest part is, you aren't longing for another city or another country. You're standing exactly where you've lived your whole life. You're on Earth. Yet something inside whispers, I want to go home. Home. A place you cannot remember. A place you cannot describe. A place that somehow feels more familiar than the world you've spent your entire life trying to fit into. How is that possible? How can someone miss a place they've never consciously seen? How can you spend decades feeling like a visitor in the only world you've ever known? Maybe that's why you've always felt different. Not better than other people, not worse, just different. You've learned how to smile at the right moments. You've learned how to hold conversations. You've learned how to build careers, maintain relationships, and move through everyday life. But somewhere beneath all of that, there has always been the quiet feeling that everyone else received an instruction manual, and yours never arrived. You watch people chase money they don't need, fight battles that don't matter, destroy each other over ideas, spend entire lives competing with strangers, and something inside you keeps asking the same question. Why? Not with judgment, with genuine confusion, because none of it has ever made sense. Perhaps you've spent years wondering whether something was wrong with you. Maybe someone called you too sensitive. Maybe they said you overthink, that you're emotional, that you care too much. Maybe you've even wondered whether anxiety or depression were the real explanation. So you tried to change yourself. You became quieter, smaller. You ignored your intuition. You learned to suppress your emotions. You convinced yourself that eventually you'd become like everyone else. But no matter how hard you tried, that strange feeling never disappeared. If anything, it became stronger. There have probably been moments in your life when you felt as though you're waiting for something. You couldn't explain what, only that life felt unfinished, almost like sitting in a train station after hearing your name called without knowing which train you're supposed to board. It's a feeling that's difficult to describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it, because it isn't ordinary anticipation. It feels cosmic, as if some forgotten part of you remembers making a promise long before you were born, a promise you've spent your entire life trying to remember. What if that feeling isn't imagination? What if it isn't anxiety? What if it isn't a coping mechanism, or wishful thinking, or escapism? What if it's a memory, trying to find its way back to the surface? Because decades ago, one woman began hearing thousands of stories that should never have matched. The people telling them had never met. They came from different countries, different religions, different cultures, different ages. Most had nothing in common. Yet when they entered the deepest states of hypnosis, they began describing the same impossible story. Not similar, the same. A story about why they had come to Earth. A story about a planet approaching a profound transformation. A story about souls who volunteered to incarnate here during one of the most turbulent periods in human history. At first, the woman conducting those sessions thought it was coincidence. Then coincidence became a pattern. Eventually, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Her name was Dolores Cannon, and what she believed she uncovered would become one of the most talked about and controversial spiritual narratives of the modern era. Whether you see it as literal truth, symbolic wisdom, or simply a fascinating way of understanding the human experience, there's one reason millions of people continue returning to her work, because somewhere within those stories, They recognize themselves, and by the end of this video, you may understand why. Welcome to Awakening Archives. This isn't a place where you're asked to believe anything blindly. It's a place where we explore ideas that have changed the way millions of people understand themselves, consciousness, and the mystery of why we're here. Some of these ideas come from ancient traditions. Others come from modern psychology. Some come from spiritual teachers whose work continues to spark both inspiration and debate. Our goal isn't to tell you what to believe. It's to invite you to explore, to question, to reflect. Because sometimes, one idea can completely change the way you see your own life. If you've ever felt disconnected from the world around you, if you've ever sensed there was something more beneath everyday reality, or if you've simply found yourself searching for answers that conventional explanations never quite satisfied, you're in the right place. Take a deep breath. Let the noise of the day fade into the background. For the next few minutes, you don't have to defend your experiences. You don't have to explain your intuition. You don't have to pretend you've never wondered whether life might be far stranger and far more beautiful. Then it appears. In this video, we're going to explore one of Dolores Cannon's most influential ideas, the concept of 5D consciousness, and the mysterious group of souls she referred to as the volunteers. We'll explore why so many people report feeling like outsiders, why hypersensitivity appears so often in these stories, why countless individuals describe a deep longing for a home they cannot remember, and why Cannon believed humanity is living through an extraordinary period of transformation. But there is one idea near the end of her teachings that changes everything. It's a single realization that completely overturns the way most people think about purpose. If you've spent years believing you were supposed to accomplish something extraordinary, what you're about to hear may be the most liberating perspective you've ever encountered. Because according to Cannon's work, your greatest contribution may have nothing to do with what you achieve, and everything to do with who you become. So before we explore the idea of 5D consciousness, we first need to understand the extraordinary story that, according to Dolores Cannon's hypnosis research, began unfolding in session after session, with people who had never met, yet somehow remembered the same impossible mission. Before we can understand what Dolores Cannon meant by 5D consciousness, we have to begin with a question that completely transformed the direction of her life's work. Ironically, it wasn't a question she was trying to answer. She wasn't searching for evidence of extraterrestrial civilizations. She wasn't trying to prove spiritual theories, and she certainly wasn't attempting to create an entirely new philosophy about humanity's future. She was simply trying to help people heal. For decades, Dolores Cannon worked as a hypnotherapist, guiding clients into deeply relaxed states so they could revisit memories they believed were connected to unresolved fears, emotional wounds, or recurring patterns in their lives. At first, the sessions unfolded much as she expected. People remembered scenes that appeared to belong to another lifetime. Some described being farmers. Others recalled lives as soldiers, artists, mothers, healers, or ordinary people living in forgotten moments of history. Whether those memories were literal past lives, symbolic experiences created by the subconscious, or something else entirely, Cannon noticed that revisiting them often helped people make sense of struggles they were facing in the present. That alone fascinated her. But then, something happened that she couldn't explain. A client entered a deep trance. Instead of describing another life on Earth, they began describing somewhere else. Not another country, not another historical period, another world. Dolores assumed it was imagination. Perhaps the mind was creating elaborate symbols. Perhaps television or books had influenced the imagery. She made a note and moved on. Weeks later, another client described something remarkably similar, then another, then another. Each session introduced details that sounded impossible. Some spoke of civilizations unlike anything found in recorded history. Others described existing as pure consciousness. Some remembered what they believed were advanced worlds, where communication happened without words. Others spoke of places where fear itself seemed absent. At first, Cannon expected the stories to contradict one another. After all, these people had never met. They lived in different countries, different cultures, different religions. Many had no interest whatsoever in science fiction or spirituality before arriving for their sessions. Yet the deeper she investigated, the stranger the pattern became. The details kept matching. Not perfectly, but consistently enough to make coincidence increasingly difficult to dismiss. Then another theme began appearing, again and again and again. These individuals didn't merely describe another place. They described making a decision, a choice. According to the accounts Cannon documented, there came a moment before birth when countless souls gathered for what they portrayed as an extraordinary mission. A mission unlike any they had accepted before. It wasn't presented as punishment, nor as karma. It was described as an act of service, a volunteer assignment. Imagine for just a moment, viewing this story as a metaphor if nothing else. Imagine you're living in a place where peace feels natural, where fear no longer dominates experience, where separation isn't the foundation of existence. Then imagine being asked to leave that environment, fully aware that the next place you'll enter will feel unimaginably dense. You'll forget who you are, forget where you came from, forget why you came. You'll experience grief, loneliness, conflict, physical pain, loss, confusion, and, perhaps the hardest part of all, you'll remember none of this until much later, if you remember it at all. Would you still volunteer? According to the stories Cannon collected, many souls did. Not because Earth was easy, because it wasn't. They came precisely because it was difficult, because transformation often happens where resistance is greatest. One detail in particular appeared repeatedly. Many of these accounts suggested that something significant changed in humanity during the middle of the 20th century. Again, this was not presented as conventional history, but as a recurring theme within Cannon's hypnosis sessions. The period surrounding the end of the Second World War appeared again and again. Clients described humanity reaching a crossroads. Technological progress had accelerated faster than emotional maturity. For the first time, human beings possessed the ability to destroy themselves on a massive scale. According to these narratives, Earth had entered an era of profound uncertainty. Whether one interprets this symbolically or literally, the message remained remarkably consistent. Humanity wasn't merely facing political or environmental challenges. It was approaching a transformation of consciousness. And if that transformation was going to happen, it would require help, not through conquest, not through rescue, not through dramatic intervention, but from within. This is where Cannon said the idea of the volunteers first emerged. The souls she encountered in these sessions didn't describe arriving as heroes. Quite the opposite. They described willingly entering one of the most emotionally challenging environments imaginable. Imagine a diver preparing to descend into the deepest part of the ocean. The deeper they go, the greater the pressure becomes. The environment changes. Visibility disappears. Everything feels heavier. According to Cannon's work, incarnating on Earth was something like that. Consciousness voluntarily entering extraordinary density. The purpose wasn't to escape the darkness. It was to carry a different kind of light into it. But there was one condition, one rule that appeared almost every single time: forgetfulness. Every volunteer described passing through what many spiritual traditions call the veil, a kind of amnesia that accompanies human birth. No memories, no roadmap, no certainty, only intuition, only fragments. Only the occasional feeling that life was somehow larger than it appeared. If this story resonates with so many people today, perhaps it isn't because everyone believes it literally. Perhaps it's because almost everyone has experienced moments that feel strangely familiar, moments that seem impossible to explain. The child who stares at the stars and feels homesick, the adult who succeeds by every conventional measure, yet still feels something essential is missing, the person who walks into a crowded room and immediately senses emotions no one has spoken aloud. Whether those experiences point to another reality, or simply reveal remarkable capacities within the human psyche, they invite an important question. What if feeling different isn't evidence that you don't belong? What if it's an invitation to discover another way of belonging? As Dolores continued documenting these sessions, another astonishing pattern emerged. The people describing this mission weren't all the same. Some seemed exhausted from the moment they were born. Others appeared calm, quietly influencing everyone around them without realizing it. Still others, especially younger generations, seemed almost incapable of accepting outdated systems or unquestioned authority. It was as though these volunteers had arrived in different groups, with different roles, at different moments in history. Cannon eventually gave those groups a name. She called them the 3 waves of volunteers, and according to her research, understanding those 3 waves may explain why you've never quite experienced life the way everyone else seems to. If you've listened this far, there's a chance you're doing something interesting. You're not simply hearing a story, you're quietly comparing it to your own life. Maybe you're remembering moments you haven't thought about in years. The first time you felt like the odd one out. The first time someone told you that you were too emotional. The first time you wondered why life seemed so much harder for you than it appeared to be for everyone else. Whether Dolores Cannon's interpretation is literally true, or simply a powerful symbolic framework, it raises an important question. Why do some people move through the world feeling as though they're speaking an entirely different emotional language? This is where Cannon's work takes another fascinating turn. As she continued documenting thousands of hypnosis sessions, she noticed something she hadn't expected. The people describing this volunteer mission weren't all describing the same experience. Some talked about overwhelming loneliness. Others described themselves as quiet observers. Still others seemed to arrive with an almost instinctive refusal to participate in systems they felt were built on fear. Eventually, Cannon grouped these experiences into what she called the 3 waves of volunteers, not as rigid categories, more like recurring patterns. And if you've ever felt that strange sense of recognition while reading spiritual material, you may understand why these descriptions have resonated with so many people. According to Cannon, the first wave arrived earliest. These were the pioneers, the ones stepping into unfamiliar territory without anyone showing them the way. Imagine being dropped into a country where you don't speak the language. You don't understand the customs. You don't know why people behave the way they do. Now imagine living there your entire life. That's how many first-wave volunteers described their experience. From childhood, they often felt disconnected, not because they disliked people. Quite the opposite. Many loved humanity deeply, but they couldn't understand humanity. They struggled to comprehend why cruelty seemed normal, why competition was celebrated, why success often appeared to require sacrificing authenticity. Many carried an overwhelming sensitivity from an early age. Teachers described them as daydreamers. Parents wondered why they seemed so serious. Friends sometimes misunderstood their need for solitude. Some spent years believing they were simply broken. Others quietly adapted, learning to wear masks that allowed them to function in a world that never quite felt like home. If this sounds familiar, it's worth pausing for a moment, because whether or not you accept Cannon's interpretation, psychology has long recognized something similar. Many highly sensitive people describe growing up with an intense awareness of emotion, conflict, and subtle social dynamics. They often feel overwhelmed by environments that others seem to navigate effortlessly. Perhaps the language is different, but the experience is remarkably familiar. According to Cannon, these early volunteers weren't failing to adapt. They were simply adapting to an environment that felt profoundly foreign. The second wave then came, what Cannon called the second wave. If the first wave were pioneers, the second wave were stabilizers. Unlike the first group, they often appeared more grounded, more balanced, less visibly distressed. Yet Cannon believed they served an equally important role. Again, this is her interpretation drawn from hypnosis sessions. She described them as people whose presence alone seemed to calm others. Have you ever met someone who didn't say very much, yet somehow made you feel safe? Someone whose calmness changed the atmosphere of an entire room? Perhaps you've worked with someone like that, or sat beside a stranger on an airplane who somehow made a stressful flight feel peaceful. We rarely notice these people because they aren't usually the loudest. They're not seeking attention. They're not trying to convince anyone of anything. Yet after spending time with them, people often leave feeling lighter. Cannon believed these volunteers weren't here to preach. They weren't here to convert. They weren't here to save anyone. They simply carried a frequency that influenced the environment around them. Whether one interprets that spiritually or psychologically, there's an interesting observation hidden inside it. Human beings constantly affect one another emotionally. Research has shown that mood spread through groups. Calm spreads. Fear spreads. Hope spreads. One person's emotional state can subtly influence dozens of others without a single word being spoken. Perhaps this idea of anchoring energy is simply another way of describing something we've always experienced. Or perhaps it's something more. The third wave. Then came the third wave. According to Cannon, these are many of the younger generations arriving now, and unlike those who came before them, they often seem unwilling to tolerate systems that older generations accepted without question. Think about the conversations happening around the world today. Young people questioning traditional careers, questioning institutions, questioning authority, questioning education, questioning the very definition of success, whether one agrees with them or not. It's difficult to deny that something has shifted. Many refuse to remain in jobs that destroy their mental health. Many openly discuss emotional well-being in ways previous generations rarely could. Many value authenticity over status, meaning over appearances, purpose over prestige. Cannon believed this wasn't accidental. She suggested these newer volunteers arrived already carrying an intuitive memory of a different way of living. Not conscious memories, more like instincts, an inner refusal to participate in systems that no longer resonate. Again, whether you see this spiritually, sociologically, or psychologically, it's an interesting lens through which to view the cultural changes unfolding around us. But regardless of which wave someone believed they belonged to, there was one experience that appeared almost universally, a feeling that is incredibly difficult to describe. Imagine attending a family gathering. Everyone is laughing, talking, sharing stories. Nothing is wrong. You love these people, they love you, and yet, somewhere deep inside, you feel like you're watching life through glass, present, but somehow separate, not disconnected emotionally, just different. You wonder whether everyone else received lessons about life that somehow skipped you. Why does everyone seem comfortable chasing things that leave you feeling empty? Why do conversations about status or money exhaust you? Why do crowded places leave you emotionally drained, while long walks in nature restore you almost instantly? Why do some relationships feel physically heavy, while others require no effort at all? Maybe you've spent years trying to explain these experiences logically. Maybe you've blamed yourself. Maybe you've wondered whether you simply need to toughen up. But Cannon's work offered a radically different interpretation. What if your sensitivity isn't something to eliminate? What if it's something to understand? Because perhaps the greatest misunderstanding about highly sensitive people is that sensitivity looks like weakness. In reality, it often requires extraordinary strength, the strength to keep showing kindness after disappointment, the strength to remain compassionate in a cynical world, the strength to continue believing in beauty while surrounded by conflict. Perhaps that is why so many people resonate with Cannon's work, not because it answers every question. But because it reframes experiences they've struggled to explain their entire lives. However, if these volunteers really came here for a purpose, there's one question we still haven't answered. Why does it feel as though everything is accelerating now? Why does the world itself seem to be changing faster than anyone can comfortably process? According to Dolores Cannon, the answer has nothing to do with coincidence. She believed humanity had entered the very period these volunteers came here to witness, the time she referred to as the Great Shift. Take a moment and think back to the world you grew up in, not just the technology, not the fashion, the feeling. Doesn't it seem as though reality itself has accelerated? Years feel shorter. Weeks disappear before you've even realized they've begun. Entire industries rise and collapse within a decade. News travels across the planet in seconds. Conversations that once took place around dinner tables now unfold in front of millions of people overnight. There is an unmistakable sense that something is speeding up. Whether you see that as technological progress, social evolution, or something more mysterious, it's difficult to deny the feeling. Many people describe living with a constant pressure they can't quite explain, almost as if the world is asking them to make a decision, to let go of something, to become someone, but they don't know exactly what. According to Dolores Cannon's work, this growing intensity wasn't random. It was one of the defining signs that humanity had entered what she called the Great Shift. Not simply a political shift, not merely an economic one, a shift in consciousness. Now it's important to understand what Cannon meant by that. She wasn't describing a magical event where the entire world suddenly wakes up overnight, nor was she suggesting that one morning people would simply vanish into another dimension. Instead, her sessions repeatedly described something much more gradual and perhaps much more challenging, a process, a transition, one that begins long before it becomes visible. Think about the changing of the seasons. Winter doesn't become spring in a single day. For weeks, both realities exist together. Some mornings feel like winter, others already smell like spring. The old season hasn't fully left. The new one hasn't fully arrived. Humanity, Cannon suggested, is living in a similar threshold. One worldview is slowly dissolving. Another is trying to emerge. And whenever two realities overlap, tension is inevitable. Look around. Across the world, institutions that once appeared permanent are being questioned. People are rethinking careers, relationships, education, leadership, success, even the meaning of happiness itself. Whether these changes represent spiritual evolution, cultural transformation, or simply the natural progression of history, something is undeniably shifting. According to Cannon, however, this transformation isn't happening only in society. It's happening inside people, especially those who feel as though they no longer fit comfortably inside old ways of living. Maybe you've noticed this in your own life. Perhaps things that once excited you no longer do. The job that once seemed successful now feels empty. The conversations you used to enjoy now leave you exhausted. The constant pressure to prove yourself somehow feels meaningless. You haven't necessarily become unhappy. You've simply become unable to pretend. That's an important distinction. Sometimes we mistake awakening for dissatisfaction. But perhaps dissatisfaction is simply the mind recognizing that it has outgrown an old identity. Imagine wearing shoes that fit perfectly when you were 12 years old. If you tried to wear them today, they wouldn't merely feel uncomfortable. They would hurt. Not because the shoes are evil, not because they're broken, because you've grown beyond them. According to Cannon's work, many people experience something similar psychologically and spiritually. Old identities begin to feel painfully small. Old fears lose their grip. Old ambitions stop motivating us, not because we've failed, because we've changed. And yet, change is rarely comfortable. The human mind loves certainty, even painful certainty. A familiar struggle often feels safer than an unfamiliar freedom, which may explain why periods of transformation can feel so overwhelming. You know something must change, but you don't yet know what life looks like afterward. It's like standing on a bridge between two worlds. You can't go back, but you can't yet see the shore ahead. Cannon believed many volunteers were experiencing exactly this feeling, not because they were failing, because they were remembering. Not memories in the traditional sense, not names, not places, more like values, an inner recognition that fear no longer feels like home, that authenticity matters more than approval, that peace feels more valuable than constant achievement. Whether we interpret that spiritually or psychologically, it's a remarkable shift, because it changes the question entirely. Instead of asking, "How do I survive this world?" the question becomes, "How do I live in alignment with who I'm becoming?" But there was one mistake. And this is where Cannon believed many people misunderstood their role. Imagine realizing the world needs healing. You see conflict everywhere, division, fear, loneliness. Naturally, you want to help, you want to fix it, to save people, to wake everyone up. Many spiritually minded people carry this burden. They believe it's their responsibility to rescue family members, to convince friends, to change strangers, to carry the emotional weight of everyone they love. Perhaps you've felt that pressure. Perhaps you've stayed awake at night wondering why people couldn't see what seemed so obvious to you. Perhaps you've tried to explain your perspective, only to be met with confusion, skepticism, or even ridicule. It hurts, not because people disagree, but because you care. The more empathy you have, the heavier that responsibility feels. Eventually, many people become exhausted, not from the world itself, but from trying to carry a world that was never theirs to carry. According to Cannon, this is where countless volunteers lost their way. They confused presence with responsibility, compassion with self-sacrifice, awareness with obligation. And then, during session after session, the same astonishing answer appeared, an answer that surprised even Cannon herself. When the subconscious was asked, "What are the volunteers supposed to do?" the answer was astonishingly simple, almost disappointingly simple. Nothing. Or more accurately, nothing. Extraordinary. No grand mission. No requirement to become famous. No obligation to build an empire. No expectation that they would save humanity single-handedly. At first, that answer made almost no sense. If someone volunteered for an extraordinary mission, how could doing nothing possibly fulfill it? That contradiction puzzled Cannon for years, until another idea emerged, one that would become one of the defining concepts in all of her work, the idea that the volunteers weren't sent here primarily to do something. They were sent here to be something, and understanding the difference changes everything, because if that's true, then your greatest contribution to this world may not be measured by your achievements, your followers, your income, or your reputation. It may be measured by something almost invisible, something quietly transforming the people around you, without either of you ever realizing it. And according to Dolores Cannon, that invisible influence has a name. She called it the antenna. Imagine carrying a burden your entire life, without ever realizing it wasn't yours to carry. Imagine believing that your worth depended on how much you accomplished, how many people you helped, how much you sacrificed, or how hard you struggled. Now imagine discovering, after years of questioning yourself, that the mission you thought required extraordinary effort was never about effort at all. According to Dolores Cannon's hypnosis research, this was the realization that changed everything. As she continued asking the subconscious why these volunteers had come to Earth, she expected an answer that sounded heroic. Perhaps they would become famous teachers. Perhaps they would lead revolutions. Perhaps they would invent technologies that transform civilization. Instead, the answer she received over and over again was astonishingly simple. They came to be. At first, Cannon herself struggled with that response. How could someone volunteer for one of the most difficult incarnations imaginable, only to do nothing. It seemed almost contradictory until another explanation began appearing in session after session. The volunteers, according to these accounts, weren't sent here primarily to change the world through action. They were sent here because of what they carried. Imagine striking a tuning fork. The metal vibrates. Moments later, another tuning fork nearby begins vibrating too. Nothing touched it. No one moved it. It simply resonated with the frequency placed into the room. Cannon believed consciousness worked in a similar way. She described these volunteers as living tuning forks, or, as she often called them, antennas. Not antennas that receive radio signals, antennas that anchor a different quality of consciousness simply by existing. Whether you interpret that literally, energetically, or psychologically, the metaphor is surprisingly powerful, because we've all experienced something similar. Have you ever walked into a room where two people had clearly been arguing without anyone saying a word? You felt the tension immediately. The atmosphere itself seemed heavy. Now think about the opposite. Have you ever met someone whose calmness seemed contagious? Someone who never gave long speeches, never demanded attention, never tried to impress anyone. Yet somehow, after spending even a few minutes with them, you felt lighter, safer, more present. Nothing obvious happened, and yet something changed. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as emotional contagion. Neuroscientists point to mirror neurons and the way human beings unconsciously regulate one another's emotional states. Spiritual traditions often describe it as presence, different language, perhaps the same observation. According to Cannon, this was the volunteers' true work, not convincing people, not forcing awakenings, not rescuing anyone, simply living from a different state of being. And that single idea completely transforms the way we look at purpose, because if your greatest contribution is your state of consciousness, then purpose isn't something you someday achieve. It's something you embody, right here, right now. But there is another part of Cannon's work that resonates deeply with so many people. It has to do with suffering. Look back over your own life for a moment. Think about the seasons that nearly broke you, the relationships that ended when you thought they never would, the nights you lay awake wondering if anyone truly understood you, the periods when you questioned your own value, your direction, even your reason for staying. Most of us instinctively ask the same question during those moments. Why is this happening to me? It's one of the oldest questions humanity has ever asked. According to Cannon's sessions, however, the volunteers viewed suffering very differently. Not as punishment, not as proof that life had gone wrong, but as part of the human experience they knowingly entered. That doesn't mean pain should be romanticized. It doesn't mean trauma is somehow desirable. Nor does it mean every hardship carries a hidden cosmic explanation. Pain is real. Loss is real. Grief deserves compassion. But Cannon's work invited people to ask a different question. Not, why did this happen? But, who am I becoming because of it? Sometimes the deepest transformations don't arrive through certainty. They arrive through surrender, through letting old identities fall away, through discovering strength you never imagined you possessed. Many people who resonate with Cannon's work say this perspective helped them stop seeing themselves as broken. Instead, they began seeing themselves as resilient. Not because suffering made them special, but because surviving it revealed capacities they didn't know they had. Compassion, patience, forgiveness, presence. Perhaps those qualities are the true measure of growth. Not titles, not achievements, not recognition, and maybe, just maybe, the home you've spent your entire life searching for was never a place. Maybe home is a way of being, a moment when the constant battle inside finally becomes quiet, a moment when you stop trying to become someone else and simply allow yourself to become fully yourself. Whether you believe Dolores Cannon's stories literally, symbolically, or somewhere in between, There is something undeniably beautiful about that possibility, that perhaps our greatest contribution to this world isn't found in changing everyone around us, but in refusing to let fear change who we are. If this conversation resonated with you, I'd love to hear why. Not because anyone here can tell you what your journey means, but because sometimes the simple act of sharing your experience reminds someone else that they aren't walking theirs alone. So tell us in the comments. Which part of Dolores Cannon's work stayed with you the most? Was it the idea of the volunteers, the 3 waves, the great shift, or was it something simpler? The possibility that your worth isn't measured by what you produce, but by the kind of presence you bring into the lives of others, wherever you are in your journey. Approach every idea with both curiosity and discernment. Ask questions, explore, reflect. The goal isn't to accept every spiritual claim without examination. The goal is to discover what helps you live with greater compassion, wisdom, and authenticity. If that's the kind of exploration you're looking for, consider subscribing to Awakening Archives. Every week we dive into the ideas, philosophies, and mysteries that continue to inspire millions of people searching for a deeper understanding of consciousness and the human experience. And if someone came to mind while you were listening today, someone who's been quietly searching for answers of their own, consider sharing this video with them. You never know which conversation arrives at exactly the right moment in someone's life. Before you leave, I'd like you to do one small thing, not because it will prove anything, not because it will change your life overnight, but because sometimes the simplest moments reveal the deepest truths. Tonight, if the sky is clear, step outside, take a slow breath, look up, really look. The stars that have watched over every generation, every civilization, every question humanity has ever asked are still there. Perhaps you'll feel that familiar ache, that quiet longing, that feeling you've carried for as long as you can remember. But this time, don't rush to explain it. Don't judge it. Just notice it. Whether that feeling comes from memory, imagination, spiritual intuition, or the remarkable mystery of being human, let it remind you of something important. You are here. Against impossible odds, you are here, breathing, learning, growing, loving, trying again, and perhaps that alone is more meaningful than you've ever allowed yourself to believe, because maybe the purpose of this life was never to become someone extraordinary. Maybe it was simply to become completely, authentically, and courageously yourself. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and above all, keep awakening.